The moment Margaret Winslow stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1874, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and the dry wind that whipped red dust across the empty Main Street did very little to reassure her either way. She stood there with her single leather trunk at her feet, her dark hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and her green eyes scanning the row of weathered storefronts that lined the one real road this town could claim. A blacksmith's shop belched smoke at the far end, a general store with a crooked wooden sign, a saloon that was already humming with noise despite the fact that it was barely past noon, and a small white church at the far edge of town that leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if tired from years of standing upright against the wind. Margaret had come a long way from Richmond, Virginia. She had come with a letter folded in the pocket of her traveling dress, a letter she had written herself and sent to a matrimonial agency 3 months prior, and a reply that had come back from a man named Benjamin Langston of Dusty Creek, Texas, who had described himself as a 32-year-old cattle rancher, owner of the Langston spread south of town, a man of steady work and honest character who was looking for a woman of similar steadiness to build a life alongside him on the frontier. She was 26 years old. She had buried her mother the previous winter, and her father 2 years before that, and she had been left with a small boarding house in Richmond that had more debt attached to it than value, and a deep, hollow ache in her chest that told her the life she was living was not the life she was meant to live. She had sold the boarding house, paid the debts, and written that letter on a cold January night with her hands trembling slightly over the paper. She had not expected Benjamin Langston to write back. He had. 3 times. And each letter had been more earnest than the last, more careful and considered in its words, more honest about the difficulties of frontier life but also about the beauty of it, the wide open sky and the land that felt like it went on forever. And something about those letters had reached right through her chest and taken hold of something she thought had gone quiet. Now she was here, and he was nowhere to be seen. She looked up and down the street again. The stagecoach driver had already unloaded the luggage and climbed back up to the box, and he gave her a look that was equal parts sympathy and hurry up as the horses stamped their impatience. Margaret straightened her spine, picked up the handle of her trunk, and dragged it toward the general store, because it seemed like the most sensible place to ask where a person might find a cattle rancher by the name of Langston. The bell above the door jangled when she pushed inside, and the smell of dried goods, coffee, and sawdust settled around her like a familiar thing. Behind the counter stood a short woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp brown eyes who took one look at Margaret and said, "You must be the woman from Virginia." "I am," Margaret said. "Margaret Winslow. I'm looking for Benjamin Langston." The woman's expression softened. "Ruth Calloway," she said, extending a hand across the counter. "My husband Henry owns this store. Benjamin's a good man. He was in here yesterday buying flour and asking what time the stage arrived." She glanced toward the window. "I suspect something out at the ranch held him up. It happens. His foreman came in about an hour ago looking for wire fencing, which usually means something's gone sideways with the cattle." "I see," Margaret said, though she didn't quite. "You can sit in the back and have some water," Ruth said firmly, in the tone of a woman who was accustomed to making decisions on behalf of people who had not quite recovered from long journeys. "He'll come. He's not the sort who doesn't." Margaret sat in the back of the store on a wooden chair beside a small iron stove that was unlit in the spring warmth, and she drank a tin cup of cool water, and she waited. He came 40 minutes later. She heard the door before she saw him, heard the heavy tread of boots on the wooden floor and Ruth's voice saying, "She's in the back, Benjamin, and I expect you to behave yourself." And then he came around the corner of the shelving, and Margaret stood up because it seemed like the right thing to do. Benjamin Langston was tall. Not the kind of tall that exists only in romantic imagination, but the kind of tall that takes up a doorway and has to develop a habit of ducking. He was lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who do physical work every day, and his face was tanned dark by the Texas sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at the horizon rather than from years. He had dark brown hair under a worn brown hat, and he was holding the hat in his hands now, turning it between his fingers in a way that told Margaret he was nervous. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that reminded her of a sky just before rain, and they were looking at her with a kind of careful attention that made her feel seen without feeling examined. "Miss Winslow," he said, and his voice was lower than she had imagined from his letters, warm with a slight Texas drawl. "I apologize for being late. We had a section of fence come down in the north pasture, and 3 steers got onto the neighboring property, and I had to—" He stopped. "I apologize. That's not interesting to you right now." "It's interesting to me," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "Is that sort of thing common?" He looked at her for a moment as if checking whether she was making conversation or asking a genuine question. He seemed to decide it was genuine. "Common enough," he said. "The land out there is hard on wire fencing. The heat expands it in summer and the cold contracts it in winter, and after enough seasons it just gives. Then it needs to be replaced rather than repaired," she said. Something moved across his expression that she could not quite name. "That's exactly what I told my foreman this morning," he said. He disagreed. "Who is right?" "I am," he said, and there was a quiet, easy confidence in the way he said it that was nothing like arrogance. "He's been working cattle longer than I've been alive, so I let him have the argument before I do the thing I was going to do anyway." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly wound coil of anxiety that had been sitting there since January. She said, "That seems wise." "I hope so," he said. He was still holding his hat. "I've got a buggy outside. I thought I'd take you out to the ranch so you can see the place before anything else happens. You should know what you're agreeing to. The house isn't much to look at yet. I've been meaning to add on to it, but the cattle work keeps—" He stopped again. "I'm sorry. I tend to talk about the ranch." "I don't mind," she said. "I want to know about it. That's why I'm here." He looked at her again, that careful, direct look, and this time she held it without looking away. Something passed between them that was not quite conversation and not quite anything else either, something that was more like the beginning of a long acknowledgement. "Well then," he said, and reached for her trunk before she could protest. "Let me show you." The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour. The road, if it could be called that, was really just a set of wheel ruts worn into the dry earth, and the buggy swayed and jolted with the terrain. The land on either side opened up vast and golden in the afternoon light, the scrub grass bending in the wind, the sky above them a blue so deep it looked solid. There were distant hills to the south shimmering in the heat haze, and occasional clusters of live oak trees casting shade that looked almost deliberate, like they had been placed there by someone thoughtful. Benjamin pointed things out as they drove. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of his property, low in spring but higher after summer rain. The windmill in the distance that he had built himself and was very proud of, though he said this in a matter-of-fact way rather than a boastful one. The line of cottonwood trees that marked where the north pasture ended. He talked about the land the way a man talks about something he loves, not with poetry but with precision and detail, and Margaret listened carefully and asked questions, and he answered them all without condescension or impatience. She had been afraid of that. She had been afraid of a man who would answer her questions about his work with a kind of tolerant humoring, the way men in Richmond had answered her questions about business and politics, and anything outside the approved sphere of feminine concern. Benjamin answered her as though her understanding of the situation was not only welcome but useful, as though he was explaining because he wanted her to know, not because he was filling silence. "How many cattle do you run?" she asked. "About 400 head right now," he said. "I'm building toward 600, but the range can only support so much until I manage the water better. There's a spring on the south end of the property that could be improved with a little engineering. I've been reading about it." "What kind of books do you read?" she asked, because this surprised her, the reading. He glanced at her sideways with something that might have been a smile. "Cattle journals, mostly. Engineering, some history. My mother sent me a novel from back east last Christmas and I read it because she'd want to know what I thought of it." "Did you like it?" He considered this seriously. "I liked parts of it," he said. "The parts where people were honest with each other, the parts where they weren't felt like a waste of time." Margaret looked out at the land ahead of them. "What novel was it?" "Something by Wilkie Collins," he said. "You know him?" "I do," she said, and felt a small, warm surprise move through her. "He's one of my favorites." Benjamin looked at her then, a real look, not the careful, guarded looks of before, and for just a moment something in his expression opened up like a window. Then the buggy hit a rut and they both grabbed the seat, and the moment passed into the ordinary, but it left something behind it, something that persisted in the air between them like the scent after rain. The ranch house appeared as they crested a low rise, and Margaret looked at it honestly and without trying to pretend it was more than it was. It was a low, solid building of whitewashed wood and stone, with a covered porch along the front and two good windows on either side of the door. There was a barn to the left, larger than the house, and several outbuildings, and a corral where 4 horses stood in the late afternoon light. There was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that had clearly been attended to recently, the soil turned and planted, though Margaret suspected Benjamin had done this in preparation for her arrival rather than as a regular practice. It was not the plantation houses of Virginia. It was not the gracious, columned architecture of everything she had grown up around. But it was solid and real, and it sat on that land as though it belonged there, as though it had grown up from the earth the same way the live oaks had, and there was something about that rootedness that spoke to Margaret more deeply than any amount of architectural elegance could have. "It's smaller than what you're used to," Benjamin said, and she could hear the careful neutrality in his voice, the way he was trying not to apologize for it. "It's honest," she said. "I'd rather have honest than impressive." He was quiet for a moment. "I intend to add 2 rooms," he said. "There's room on the east side. I've got the lumber already, I just haven't." "You've been building a cattle ranch," she said. "The rooms can come when they come." He pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the house and sat for a moment with the reins in his hands, looking ahead rather than at her. "Miss Winslow," he said carefully, "I want to be clear with you about something before we go further. I know the arrangement that brought you here. I know what the letters said and what both of us agreed to in writing, but I want you to know that nothing about this is decided until you decide it. You can see the place, and if it isn't what you want, I'll put you back on the stage myself and I won't think any worse of you for it." Margaret looked at the side of his face, the strong jaw and the honest set of his mouth, and she said, "That is a very decent thing to say." "I mean it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm staying." He turned to look at her then, and the gray eyes were warm now, genuinely warm, the careful distance of earlier burned away by something more immediate. He said, "All right then," and got down from the buggy to help her with her trunk, and that was how it began in earnest. The first weeks were a careful, and sometimes awkward navigation of proximity and newness. Margaret took the small bedroom on the left side of the house, which Benjamin had outfitted with a decent iron bedstead and a quilt made by his mother, and Benjamin took the room on the right, and between them the kitchen and the main room of the house were shared territory where they learned each other gradually, like 2 people learning the currents of a new river. She learned that he woke before dawn every day without an alarm, that he drank his coffee black and strong, that he ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint, but that certain foods made him brighten visibly, cornbread especially, and anything with molasses. She learned that he was quiet in the mornings and more talkative in the evenings after supper, that he had a dry humor that emerged slowly and rewarded patience, and that he read by the lamp at night for an hour before bed with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He learned that she was a better cook than she had let on in her letters, that she had strong opinions about the proper way to do most things and was willing to defend them, that she was genuinely fearless about the physical reality of the ranch in a way that surprised him, that she would walk out to the barn at night without hesitation, and that she had an instinct with the horses that developed quickly into something useful. He learned that she cried sometimes in the mornings, quietly, when she thought no one could hear, and that this stopped after the first week and a half, and that after it stopped she seemed to settle into herself like water settling in a glass. There was a day, about 3 weeks in, when everything shifted. It was a Tuesday, and the day had started in ordinary enough fashion, but a storm came in fast in the afternoon, the kind that rolls across the Texas plains without much warning, turning the sky green-black and sending the cattle into nervous motion along the fences. Margaret had been in the kitchen garden when the wind picked up, and she had looked at the sky and known immediately that this was serious. She had gone to the barn first and closed it properly, because 2 of the stall doors had been left on their latches rather than bolted, and she did not want the horses getting loose in a storm. Then she had gone back to the house and closed all the shutters she could reach. Benjamin came riding in from the north pasture at a hard gallop just as the first real rolls of thunder came, and he pulled the horse up short outside the barn and got down and led her inside. And by the time he came out, the rain was starting in those first heavy, widely spaced drops that are the warning before the deluge. He came inside the house and stopped when he saw the shutters closed, and the lamp lit, and the kitchen stove going, and Margaret at the table with a cup of coffee already poured and waiting. He stood there with water beginning to spot his jacket and hat, and he looked at all of this, the closed shutters and the warm kitchen and the waiting coffee, and something moved across his face that was not quite the careful, measured expression he usually wore. "You got the barn shuttered," he said. "The stall doors too," she said. "The 2 east ones were only latched." He took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door. He sat down across from her and took the coffee and drank it without speaking for a moment, while the rain began outside in earnest, hammering the roof and the windows and turning the world outside the shutters into sound. Then he said, "Thank you, Margaret." It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him across the table, at the rain-darkened shoulders of his jacket and the gray eyes and the careful, honest face, and she said, "Of course," and meant it as something larger than the words themselves. The storm lasted 2 hours. They sat at that table for most of it, talking in a way they had not quite talked before, less careful, less formal, with the rain shutting out the world and creating a small, warm interior space where it seemed easier to be honest. He told her about his father, who had come to Texas from Georgia after the war and built the first part of the ranch with his own hands, who had died of a fever 8 years ago when Benjamin was 24, and left him the land and very little else. She told him about Richmond, about the boarding house and the long years of managing it, and the slow wearing down of being responsible for everything alone. She told him about her mother, who had been sharp and funny, and had taught her that a woman ought to know how to do most things herself rather than waiting for someone to do them for her, and how she had missed that voice every day since December. He listened the way he did everything, with full attention, without interrupting, without offering comfort that hadn't been asked for. When she finished talking about her mother, he said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." "She was," Margaret said. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for men who talked a great deal about nothing." He smiled then, a real smile rather than the careful almost smiles of before, and it changed his face completely, made it younger and warmer, and Margaret felt something in her chest that she recognized and decided to leave alone for the moment, because it was too new and too large to examine directly. The storm passed, and the sky cleared into that washed, particular blue that comes after Texas rain, and they went outside to check on the stock and the property, walking together in the cooling evening air, and Benjamin pointed out the water standing in the low part of the north pasture, and said he was going to need to drain that before the mosquitoes found it. And Margaret said she had read something in one of his agricultural journals about drainage methods, and he looked at her with an expression that was purely delighted, as though he had been given an unexpected gift. They were becoming friends. That was the only honest word for it, and Margaret held it carefully, knowing that friendship was the best foundation for what was supposed to come next, knowing that it was better to build slowly on something solid than to rush towards something that looked like love but was really only urgency. But it was not only friendship. She would have been lying to herself if she had called it only that. It was the way he stood slightly too close sometimes when they were looking at something together, his shoulder near her shoulder, and never moved away. It was the way he watched her from across the yard sometimes when she was at the kitchen garden, a look she had caught twice now, and that he had not pretended he was not giving. It was the evenings when they read near the lamp, sitting across the table from each other, and the comfortable silence between them was not empty but full of something warm and unspoken. The wedding had been arranged for the end of May, a simple ceremony at the little leaning white church, performed by the Reverend Abbot who served several ranching communities in the area and came through Dusty Creek every 3 weeks. This was what the letters had agreed to. This was the plan. As April wore into May, Margaret found herself less and less certain about the plan, not because she wanted to leave, but because what she felt was no longer the considered, practical arrangement she had boarded the stage with in March. It was something fiercer and less manageable than that. She found herself in a state of heightened awareness around Benjamin that was neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome, a kind of alert tenderness that made everything more vivid, the way he moved, the sound of his voice calling to his hands across the yard, the particular set of his hands when he was working, strong and certain and unhurried. And she was afraid. Not of him, never of him, but of the size of what she felt, and the fact that she had come here as a practical arrangement and had somehow stumbled into something that felt like nothing so much as the beginning of loving someone very much. One evening in the second week of May, they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last of the light go out of the sky in long horizontal bands of orange and purple, and Margaret said, without entirely planning to, "Benjamin, I want to ask you something honestly." "All right," he said, without looking away from the sky. "When you answered my letter," she said, "what did you actually want? Not in the practical sense. What did you want?" He was quiet for a long moment. An owl called somewhere out toward the creek, low and inquiring. "I wanted someone to talk to," he said. "That sounds plain, but I mean it in the fullest sense. I wanted someone whose mind I could respect and whose company I didn't have to be anyone except myself in. I wanted someone who wanted to be here, not someone who was making the best of somewhere they'd rather not be." He paused. "I wanted a real marriage, not a contract." "Is that what this feels like?" she asked carefully. "A real one?" He turned to look at her then. The last light was gold on his face and his gray eyes were very direct. "Yes," he said, "more than I expected. More than I knew how to expect." Her heart was doing something complicated and she put both hands flat on her knees to steady herself. "I didn't expect it either," she said. "I thought I was being practical. I thought I had learned the difference between practical and reckless. And now," he said, "now I think the practical thing and the right thing have turned out to be the same thing," she said, "but I couldn't have known that from a letter." He was very still beside her. Then he said, "Margaret," and there was something in the way he said it, something in the particular weight and care of it, that made her turn to look at him. He was looking at her with the full, open expression that she had only seen glimpses of before, all the careful distance gone, and he said, "I want to tell you something honestly in return." "Go ahead," she said. "I think I've been in love with you since you told me the fence needed replacing rather than repairing," he said, "which I know is a strange thing to say." She laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and then she said, "It is strange, yes, but I know exactly what you mean." She looked at the darkening sky and said, "I think I've been falling in love with you since the storm, since you said thank you and used my name." He reached over and took her hand from her knee, carefully, and she turned her hand to hold his, and they sat there in the cooling evening air with the stars coming out one by one above the Texas plain, holding hands on the porch of the ranch house, and it was entirely simple and entirely overwhelming at the same time. The Reverend Abbott arrived in Dusty Creek on the 22nd of May, and on the 24th, Benjamin Langston and Margaret Winslow were married in the leaning white church with Ruth Calloway and her husband Henry as witnesses, and a handful of neighboring ranchers and their wives who had driven in, because news travels fast in ranch country and a wedding is an occasion. Margaret wore a dress she had brought from Richmond, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons at the wrist, not a wedding dress exactly but close enough, and she had put flowers from the kitchen garden in her hair, yellow ones that she did not know the Texas name for. Benjamin wore his best clothes, which Ruth had apparently pressed for him the previous evening, and he stood at the front of the church with the look of a man who is about to do the most important thing he has ever done and knows it. When he took her hand at the altar, his grip was steady. She looked at him and he looked at her, and whatever nerves there might have been dissolved in that direct gaze, that honest, rain-gray look that she had come to trust entirely. Reverend Abbott was a small, cheerful man who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and no unnecessary length, and when he said the final words and Benjamin kissed her, it was brief and careful and tasted like a promise rather than a performance, and she put her hand against his jaw for a moment afterward, and he closed his eyes briefly, and then they turned together to face the small assembly in the pews. Ruth Calloway was crying, which she denied immediately upon being asked about it. The summer arrived in full Texas force, carrying heat that sat on the land like a physical weight and turned the creek low and the grass gold, and the work of the ranch intensified with the season. Margaret had become genuinely useful in ways that surprised even Benjamin, who had not underestimated her, but had perhaps not imagined the full range of what she would take on. She managed the household accounts with a precision that identified several areas where they had been losing small amounts of money to careless record-keeping. She learned to ride, properly ride, not the careful side-saddle riding of her Virginia youth, but the practical working ride that the ranch required. And within 2 months, she was confident enough that Benjamin stopped worrying when she rode out alone to check on the kitchen garden well or the creek levels. She made friends with Benjamin's foreman, a weathered, permanently skeptical man named Amos Hurd, who was 60 years old and had been working cattle in Texas since before the war, and who had regarded Margaret's arrival with the specific wariness of a man who has seen households disrupted by newcomers. Margaret had won him over not by trying to, but by doing exactly what she said she would do, and never asking for more information than she needed, and always bringing him coffee when she brought Benjamin coffee, which he accepted without comment, but which she noted he appreciated. There was a difficulty in July, and it was this. A man named Dwight Carver, who owned the large spread to the northwest of the Langston property, came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning with 2 of his hired hands and an attitude that Margaret read as trouble from the moment she saw him coming up the drive. Carver was a big, florid man in his late 40s with a way of standing that took up more space than was necessary, and he had apparently been disputing the boundary line between the 2 properties for the better part of a year, a dispute that Benjamin had mentioned to Margaret in passing, but had not seemed particularly worried about. He should perhaps have been more worried about it. Carver got down from his horse and did not wait to be invited into the house, just walked up onto the porch and said, "Langston, we need to settle the question of the North Creek line once and for all. I've had my man Briggs resurvey the boundary and it comes up 120 feet different from your marker." Benjamin came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and said calmly, "Good morning, Dwight. You want to come in?" "I want to settle this," Carver said. "And we can," Benjamin said in the same measured tone. "But I've had that line surveyed twice, and both times it comes to the same place. If your man Briggs came to a different result, I'd want to see his measurements," because surveying 120 feet worth of error would be a remarkable mistake. Carver's face darkened. "Are you calling my man a liar?" "I'm saying measurements can be incorrect," Benjamin said, "which is why I'm asking to see them. That's not an accusation, that's standard practice." Margaret was standing in the doorway of the house during this exchange, having come to the door when she heard the horses. She watched Benjamin with quiet attention. She had never seen him in a confrontation before, and what she saw was not the performance of calmness but the real thing. A man who was genuinely unintimidated, not because he was careless, but because he knew his ground. Carver glanced at her with the kind of look that dismissed and moved on, and Margaret kept her expression politely neutral and said, "Mr. Carver, may I offer you and your men some water? You've ridden a distance." The offer wrong-footed him slightly, which was exactly what she intended. He said, "I'm not here for water," but the edge of the confrontation had softened. Benjamin said, "I'll tell you what, Dwight. Have Briggs write up his survey measurements and bring them over. I'll have mine ready. We'll look at them together, and if there's a discrepancy, we'll figure out where it came from. If it turns out your line is right, I'll adjust the marker and that'll be the end of it. But I'm not moving a property marker on the basis of someone say-so. That's not unreasonable." Carver looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and then something in his posture settled, not happily, but with the grudging acknowledgement of a man who has been given an offer that is genuinely fair and cannot in good conscience refuse it. "Fine," he said. "I'll have Briggs come by Friday." "Friday's fine," Benjamin said. Carver rode out without further ceremony, and Benjamin came back up to the porch, and Margaret handed him a cup of water and said, "That was well done." "He's not a bad man," Benjamin said, drinking the water. "He just doesn't like feeling like he's losing something, even when he isn't. If the surveys match, which they will, that'll be the end of it. And if they don't, then I'll deal with what's true," he said simply. On Friday the surveys were compared and the discrepancy was found. Briggs had made an error with his instrument calibration that had shifted all his measurements by a consistent amount. Carver was not pleased about this, but he was fair enough to acknowledge it, and the marker stayed where it was, and after that the relationship between the two ranches, while not warm, was at least no longer a source of anxiety. August brought something unexpected. Margaret realized, on a quiet morning in the first week of the month, with a certainty that had been building for several weeks, that she was expecting their first child. She sat with this knowledge for a day before telling Benjamin, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted a moment alone with the size of it, the sudden vivid reality of this life she had built from a letter written on a cold January night in Richmond. She told him that evening after supper, while they were sitting on the porch in the way that had become their habit, the stars coming out above the plain, the horses settled in the barn. She said, "Benjamin, I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her and must have read something in her expression, because his face went very still in the way it did when he was paying full attention to something important. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "Sometime in the late spring, I think, or early summer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He reached over and took her hand and held it with both of his and said, "Margaret," and then could not seem to find more words than that. But his hand said everything he couldn't, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there for a long while in the warm August night with the crickets loud in the grass, and the world felt very full and very good. He told Amos the next morning. Amos received this information by removing his hat, holding it against his chest for a moment with an expression of genuine emotion that he then promptly buried under several layers of gruffness, saying, "Well, the bunkhouse roof still needs fixing. That ought to be done before winter." "It will be," Benjamin said. "Good," said Amos and put his hat back on, and that was all he said about it, but he brought an extra armload of firewood to the house kitchen that evening without being asked, which was his way. The fall moved through in long golden days and cooling nights, and the ranch settled into the rhythms of the season. the cattle work shifting to the preparations for winter, the kitchen garden being put to bed, the firewood stacked, the house made tight against the cold that would come. Benjamin did add the 2 rooms to the east side of the house, working on weekends with Amos and 2 of the ranch hands, and by November the house was larger and warmer and had a proper nursery with a window that looked east toward the sunrise. There was a period in November when Margaret received a letter from a solicitor in Richmond, informing her that a distant cousin of her father's had died and left a small inheritance. Not a fortune, but enough to be significant, enough to purchase the lumber and hardware to properly upgrade the barn and replace all the fencing in the north pasture with new wire rather than patching the old. Benjamin's reaction to this news was to say, "That's yours, Margaret, it came to you." "It came to us," she said. "I don't think in those divisions." "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "The barn roof is showing wear," she said, "and the north fence," he smiled. "I was going to say the same thing." "I know," she said. "That's why it's easy to decide." That winter was a hard one. It snowed in early December, which was unusual for that part of Texas, and the temperature dropped to levels that required real vigilance about the stock. Benjamin and Amos spent long days out with the cattle, making sure the animals had access to water that wasn't frozen and shelter against the worst of the wind. And Margaret ran the household with the efficiency of a woman who understood that the difference between comfort and suffering in a Texas winter was largely a matter of preparation and attention. She had begun to show considerably by December, the pregnancy moving forward with a smooth, uncomplicated steadiness that was reassuring, and she had begun to correspond with Mrs. Helene Marsh in town, who served the community as a midwife, a capable woman in her 50s who had delivered half the children in the county and whose calm practicality was deeply comforting. The worst night of that December cold came on the 19th, when the temperature dropped so fast and so far that Benjamin came in from the barn at midnight with ice in his beard and his hands red and stiff, and Margaret met him at the door with warm water for his hands and a heavy blanket, and told him firmly that Amos was capable of handling the rest of the night and that he needed to come inside. He had argued briefly, and she had said, "Your hands are nearly frostbitten and your wife is 7 months pregnant. You are coming inside." He had come inside. Later, sitting by the stove with the warmth coming back into his hands and a cup of strong tea in front of him, he looked at her with the warm, complicated expression she had come to love best, the one that meant he was feeling something large and was not going to pretend he wasn't. He said, "What would I have done without you here this winter?" "Frozen to death, probably," she said, and he laughed, and she loved the sound of it. "Probably," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, careful of the redness. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "What would have happened if I hadn't written that letter, if I'd let the boarding house debt scare me into staying put?" "Don't think about it," he said. "It didn't happen that way." "No," she agreed. "It didn't." Christmas came with a quietness that Margaret found she loved, so different from the social obligations and performances of Richmond Christmases. They exchanged modest gifts. Benjamin had carved her a small wooden box for her letters and papers, precise and smooth and beautiful in its simplicity, and she had made him a new pair of riding gloves with thick lining, understanding by now exactly what his hands needed in the cold. They had dinner at the Calloway house in town with Ruth and Henry and 4 other families from the area, a long table and good food, and the kind of company that knew itself well. And on the ride home in the cold starlit night, Benjamin put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his warmth, and the horses moved steadily through the dark, and it was one of the happiest evenings of her life. The new year came in quietly on the ranch. January and February were the slow months, the months where the work turned inward, where equipment was repaired and accounts were balanced and plans were made for the coming year. Benjamin spent hours at the table with his land maps and his cattle journals, and Margaret sat across from him with her books and her mending, and occasionally her opinions about what he was planning, which he received with the same serious attention he gave to Amos's opinions, weighing them honestly and incorporating what was useful. She had begun to feel the pregnancy in her back by January, and she moved more slowly and rested more, and Benjamin noticed everything without making her feel managed or diminished by his attention. He simply appeared when something needed lifting and disappeared again without comment. He asked Mrs. Marsh to come to the ranch in February for a proper visit to check on Margaret's progress, and Mrs. Marsh declared everything to be exactly as it should be and drank 2 cups of Ruth Calloway's excellent coffee, and told several stories about difficult winter births that made both Benjamin and Margaret simultaneously reassured and alarmed. March arrived with the smell of rain and new grass, and the ranch came alive again as it always did in the spring, calves arriving and the work multiplying, and Amos was everywhere at once with the controlled intensity of a man in his element, and the ranch hands rode long days and came in dusty and tired, and there was a humming, productive energy in everything that Margaret found she loved entirely. She went into labor on a Thursday in late April, a full 2 weeks before Mrs. Marsh's estimate, and it was a shorter labor than expected, which Mrs. Marsh called a blessing, and which Margaret, in the midst of it, had no particular interest in arguing about. Benjamin sat in the main room of the house with his hat in his hands, which he had been turning in exactly the same way as the day she had first seen him, and Amos sat beside him for most of it without saying anything, which was the most companionable thing Amos knew how to do. Their son was born in the early evening, when the light coming through the east window was exactly the golden color of late afternoon, and he was healthy and loud and had, as Mrs. Marsh noted with a kind of proprietary satisfaction, a very good set of lungs. Benjamin came in when Mrs. Marsh called him, and he stood in the doorway of the nursery looking at Margaret in the bed with the baby in her arms, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, something that was not quite any single expression but all of them at once, love and fear and wonder and gratitude and an overwhelming, very quiet kind of joy. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression so naked and unguarded that Margaret felt tears on her own face, which she hadn't expected. "He's all right," Benjamin said. His voice was not quite steady. "He's perfect," Margaret said. "Come look at him properly." He looked. The baby was wrinkled and pink and indignant looking, and he was the most beautiful thing Benjamin had ever seen in his life. And he didn't say that because he didn't have words for it, but he looked at Margaret over the baby's head with those rain-gray eyes that she knew so well, and she saw everything she needed to see in them. "What do we name him?" she asked. "I'd like to call him Thomas," he said, "after my father if you're willing." "Thomas Langston," she said and tested it. "Yes, I'm willing." Thomas Benjamin Langston, as it was eventually written in the church register when Reverend Abbott came through, because Margaret insisted that he carry his father's name somewhere in the arrangement of his own. Thomas was a good baby in the way that babies are sometimes good as though by natural disposition, alert and interested in the world, quick to be soothed by his father's low voice and slow rocking, and fiercely opinionated about feeding schedules. Margaret recovered quickly and was back to her full capacity within 3 weeks, which Mrs. Marsh said was a testament to her excellent constitution, and which Margaret attributed to the fact that the work needed doing and Thomas needed feeding, and that there was very little time to be anything other than functional. The spring and summer of 1875 passed in a full, good richness. Thomas grew from a pink, indignant creature into a wide-eyed, determinedly mobile infant who had, by August, developed strong feelings about being left in one place when he could see interesting things happening elsewhere. Benjamin carried him on the morning rounds of the ranch with a frequency that Amos regarded with visible but unspeakable amusement, a full-grown cattle rancher walking the pasture fence lines with a baby in the crook of his arm, pointing out the features of the land as though conducting a tour. "He can't understand any of it," Margaret said one evening, watching through the window as Benjamin stood at the corral fence with Thomas on his hip, apparently introducing the baby to the horses. "Probably not," she agreed with herself, watching Thomas's hand reach out toward the nearest horse with the specific, delighted fearlessness of a baby who has not yet learned what things are worth being afraid of. Summer brought other changes. Ruth Calloway, who had become Margaret's closest friend in those months, told her over coffee in the general store one afternoon that a family called the Harmon family had arrived in the area and were settling on a piece of ground 3 miles north of the Langston ranch, and that the Harmon family included a daughter about Margaret's age named Clara who was quiet and capable, and had apparently already fixed the wheel on their wagon without assistance, which Ruth offered as evidence of good character. Margaret rode over to meet the Harmons on a Wednesday morning with Thomas bundled against her on the saddle, because she had become excellent enough a rider by this point that she trusted herself to manage both, and she found Clara Harmon to be exactly as Ruth described, a compact, practical young woman with a quick smile and an impressive command of agricultural knowledge, who welcomed Margaret with genuine warmth and said, "Thank God." Another woman who can talk about something other than the price of beef, which made Margaret laugh harder than she had laughed in weeks. They became fast friends. Clara was 23, unmarried, and had come west with her parents and 2 brothers to try to make something on the frontier, and she had strong opinions about nearly everything and expressed them with an enjoyable directness that Margaret found refreshing. She came to the Langston Ranch for Sunday dinners regularly through the fall, and she and Benjamin developed the comfortable, bantering relationship of people who respect each other, but are not remotely interested in impressing each other. And Amos regarded her with the grudging approval he reserved for people who did what they said they would. In the fall of 1875, something happened that tested the Langston Ranch in a different way from storms and cold and survey disputes. A drought came, settling over that part of Texas with a dry, relentless persistence that turned the creek to a trickle by October and made the south pasture grass go brown and thin and barely adequate. Benjamin had been watching the water tables all year and had been worried since July, and when the fall came dry, he had already begun to implement the water management ideas he had been researching, the spring improvement on the south end of the property, and a series of small earthwork berms to direct whatever rain did come into useful places. It was hard work and it was not enough by itself, but it was more than doing nothing, and when the neighboring ranches were struggling with stock losses, the Langston cattle came through the dry fall in better condition than most. The spring improvement, which Margaret had helped plan and which Amos and the hands had built over 3 weekends in August, proved particularly valuable, maintaining a reliable water source through the driest months. Carver, of all people, came to Benjamin in November and asked what he had done about the water. He asked in the gruff, reluctant way of a man who hates needing to ask anything, and Benjamin told him plainly and without any sense of superiority, because the drought was not something to be superior about, and because the land was everyone's problem when it was dry. Carver took the information and acted on some of it and came through the drought better than his previous years would have suggested, and whatever remaining friction existed between the 2 ranches dissipated quietly after that in the practical solidarity of people who are working the same hard land. Margaret wrote about the drought in her letters back east to an old friend in Richmond named Caroline, who had been corresponding with her since her departure. The letters she received back were full of the social news of Richmond society, engagements and dinners and the small politics of a life she had once been part of, and Margaret read them with affection and without any particular longing, because she understood clearly now that she had not been hiding in Richmond exactly, but she had been waiting for the life that felt like hers, and she had found it in this dry, wide, demanding, beautiful place. The winter of 1875 was milder than the previous year, and Thomas spent it learning to walk, which he did at 11 months with the same purposeful, slightly early determination he brought to everything, and which resulted in an immediate reassessment of what needed to be out of his reach. Benjamin spent a quiet afternoon reorganizing the lower shelves of the house with the focused gravity of a man doing important structural work. And Margaret watched him and tried not to smile too visibly and mostly failed. By the spring of 1876, Thomas was a walking, increasingly talking, deeply interested child of just over a year, and the ranch had come through the drought and the winter in good shape, and the new fence in the north pasture was holding perfectly, as Margaret had said it would, and the barn roof was solid and the accounts were healthy, and life on the Langston spread had a settled, rooted quality that felt like something built to last. There was one morning, in April of 1876, that Margaret would think about for years afterward. Benjamin had come in from the early rounds, and Thomas was in his high chair at the kitchen table, eating with the fierce concentration of a toddler. And Benjamin sat down across from Margaret and poured his coffee and looked around the kitchen, at the table with its worn, comfortable surface, and the good iron stove and the window over the sink that showed the morning light coming in gold across the pasture, and he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked up from the bread she was cutting. He had his coffee in both hands and was looking at her with that open expression that she loved, nothing held back. "I wrote that letter to the agency," he said, "because Amos told me I was becoming impossible to work with, and that I needed to talk to someone who wasn't a cow or a fence post." He paused. "That's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had built this place to be exactly what I wanted it to be, and then I realized I'd forgotten to think about who I was building it for. And I didn't know how to say that to anyone, so I wrote it in a letter to a stranger instead." Margaret put down the bread knife. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day I'm glad. I want you to know that." Thomas banged his cup on the tray of his high chair and said something that sounded approximately like more, which it was, and the moment gave way to the ordinary morning in the way of moments in households where small people with insistent needs are present, but the ordinary morning was very good. The kitchen was warm and the light was gold, and there was bread on the table and coffee, and a child who was loudly requesting more of everything. And the man across the table was looking at her with more love than she knew quite what to do with except return it in full measure. The summer of 1876 was a full one. The ranch was doing well enough that Benjamin hired a second full-time hand, a young man named Jerome Tate, who was 20 years old and originally from Louisiana, and who had arrived in Dusty Creek on the stage looking for work, and had been pointed to the Langston spread by Ruth Calloway, who seemed to have appointed herself the employment agency of the town. Jerome was quiet and hardworking, and had an instinct with the horses that even Amos acknowledged, which was not a small thing. He settled into the bunkhouse with Amos and the other hand with the ease of a person who had learned to make himself useful early, and found it to be a reliable strategy. Clara Harmon, who was still a regular visitor to the ranch, had by this point developed a particular awareness of Jerome's existence that she expressed by pretending not to have noticed him at all, which Margaret observed with private amusement and reported to Benjamin one evening with a level of detail that he received with patient tolerance. "You're very interested in this," he observed. "I'm interested in people," she said. "It's different." "Of course," he said. "She goes very quiet when he walks through," Margaret said, "and she's not naturally a quiet person." "I'd noticed," he said. "You had," she said, surprised. "Jerome asks about the Harmon property a lot," Benjamin said. "More than the work requires." Margaret considered this. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "It's not my business," he said. "They're both grown adults." "That's very sensible of you," she said. "It's also deeply unsatisfying." He smiled. "Let them find their own way," he said. "It worked out well enough for us." It did, in fact, work out. By October, Jerome had ridden over to the Harmon property on a Sunday morning on the pretense of asking Clara's father about a piece of land he thought he'd seen near their eastern boundary, a pretense so thin as to be nearly transparent. And Clara's father, who was a practical man, had looked at the young man in front of him and said, "Clara's in the kitchen, if you want to state your actual business." Jerome had gone to the kitchen, and whatever was said there was said privately. But Clara arrived at the Langston Ranch for Sunday dinner 2 weeks later with a brightness about her that had a specific quality to it. The brightness of someone who has been heard and found it as good as they had hoped it would be. Margaret embraced her and said nothing about it directly, because that was how you respected something tender, and Benjamin shook Jerome's hand after dinner with the warmth of a man who is genuinely pleased. And Amos, when informed of the development, said that Jerome had better keep his attention on his work, but said it in a tone that meant congratulations. The courtship that followed was a proper one and a genuine one, and it concluded, in the spring of 1877, with a wedding in the same leaning white church where Benjamin and Margaret had married, and the same reverend abbot performing the ceremony with the same cheerful efficiency. Margaret stood beside Clara as witness and held Thomas, who was now 2 years old and opinionated about ceremonies, requiring a fairly constant campaign of quiet management to prevent him expressing his opinions aloud at inconvenient moments. Benjamin stood beside Jerome, and afterward at the small celebration at the Harmon place, he and Margaret stood together near the edge of the gathering and watched Jerome and Clara move through the room together with the particular shining quality of people who have just made the most significant commitment of their lives and have not yet stopped being amazed by it. "Do you remember what that felt like?" Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Benjamin said. He had his arm around her waist and she was leaning slightly into his side, an automatic arrangement that they had long since stopped noticing consciously. "Do you?" "I remember being terrified," she said. "And I remember that the terror and the certainty were exactly the same size, and I didn't know which one to listen to." "Which one?" She looked up at him. "The certainty," she said. "Obviously." He pressed a kiss to her hair, brief and warm, and Thomas, who was between them holding their hands with the proprietary grip of a child who considers his parents primarily in terms of their usefulness to him, said cake, because he had seen it on the table and had excellent priorities. "In a minute," Benjamin told him. "Cake now," Thomas said. "In a minute," they both said, at exactly the same time, and looked at each other with the helpless, amused exasperation of parents, and it was one of the thousands of small moments that accumulate into a life, insignificant individually and everything in their accumulation. The years settled into themselves. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically but solidly, the way things grow in dry country, by persistence and good management and attention. Benjamin's idea for improving the South Spring was eventually expanded into a more ambitious water management system that a young engineer passing through Dusty Creek helped design, and by 1878 the Langston Ranch had one of the more reliable water situations in the county, which was noticed and occasionally envied. Amos Hurd retired in the fall of 1878, at 64, moving to a small house in Dusty Creek that he had apparently owned for years without mentioning, and his retirement was celebrated at the ranch with a dinner that Margaret prepared with the same care she brought to everything, and at which Amos ate more than she had ever seen him eat and still maintained the expression of a man who considers demonstrations of emotion to be a form of weakness. He shook Benjamin's hand at the end of the evening for a very long time and said nothing beyond, "You've done all right, Langston," and Benjamin said, "Not without you, Amos." And that was the whole of it, and it was everything it needed to be. Jerome took on the foreman role with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and he and Clara had settled into the neighboring Harmon property, which Clara's parents had formally transferred to them in the spring, and the two ranches had become so naturally allied in their operations that the boundary between them had a friendly quality, the fence line being more a formality than a barrier. Margaret had, by this time, established herself in the community as a person whose judgment people trusted, and whose practical help was reliably available. She organized the first real lending library in Dusty Creek, a collection of donated books that lived in the back room of the Callaway General Store and circulated through the ranching community on an honor system that worked better than most organized systems she had seen. She was involved with the small school that had been established in 1877, helping with supplies and volunteering to teach reading to the youngest children twice a week, which she did with a genuine love for the work that made even the most reluctant children eventually enthusiastic. She also, without quite planning to, had become the person people came to when they needed a letter written or a document read or a contract explained, because literacy in the region was patchwork, and she had a gift for explaining complicated things plainly, without ever making the person in front of her feel inadequate for asking. Benjamin watched this role develop with a deep, quiet pride that he expressed by ensuring she always had good paper and ink and a proper lamp to work by, which was his way. Thomas, at 4 years old, was a tall, dark-haired, gray-eyed child who combined his mother's intelligence and stubbornness with his father's physical fearlessness, and his father's particular habit of quiet, concentrated attention. He had attached himself to the horses with a devotion that seemed almost biological, and Benjamin, who had begun teaching him in the careful, unhurried way he did everything, had by Thomas's 5th birthday declared him the most naturally capable horseman he had seen at that age, which made Thomas puff up with a pride that made Margaret bite her lip against laughter. In the fall of 1879, Margaret became pregnant again. She discovered it on a morning in September with the same quiet internal certainty she had felt the first time, and she told Benjamin that evening on the porch in what had become their way, the stars coming out above the plain and the horses settled, and the world quiet around them. His response this time had more of joy and less of the particular, stunned stillness of the first time, because he knew now what was coming and what it meant. But the way he held her hand was if anything more tender, because he understood better now what it cost and what it gave. "Thomas will have opinions about this," Margaret said. "Thomas has opinions about everything," Benjamin said fondly. "He'll adapt." He did, after a period of adjustment that involved several pointed conversations about what a brother or sister would and would not be able to do, and a significant amount of negotiating about whose domain various parts of the house would belong to. By the time the baby arrived in the late spring of 1880, Thomas had resigned himself to the situation with the pragmatic adaptability of a 5-year-old who has been given adequate preparation, and had decided that a sibling was primarily useful as an audience. The second child was a boy also, arrived in May with the same healthy loudness as his brother, and they named him Robert after Margaret's father, and Thomas inspected him with the serious air of an assessor and declared him very small, and that he would probably be all right, which everyone in the room chose to receive as a warm welcome. Robert grew, as second children often do, in the lengthening shadow of a very present older sibling, but he developed a personality that was distinct and entirely his own, quieter than Thomas in the way of water that runs deeper, with his mother's green eyes and a stubborn patience that was all his own. Where Thomas moved through the world with the confident assertion of someone who expects to be heard, Robert observed carefully and spoke rarely but precisely, and when he said something everyone tended to listen, because he had generally thought it through. The years of the early 1880s were good years for the Langston Ranch and for the family that ran it. The cattle business was productive. The water management system had become a genuine competitive advantage. The house had been added to twice and was now a proper home with space for a family and for guests, and a library room that Margaret had quietly built through the accumulation of good books over many years. The kitchen garden had grown into something serious, producing enough through the season to supplement the household year-round, and to share with neighbors in the abundant years. Ruth Calloway had become in those years something like a grandmother to Thomas and Robert, a role she had grown into through pure frequency of presence and genuine affection. And Henry Calloway could often be found on the Langston porch on Sunday afternoons, in conversation with Benjamin about cattle prices and weather, and the general state of things, in the comfortable, repetitive way of men who have been talking to each other for years, and have no particular agenda beyond the pleasure of the company. There was a moment in the summer of 1882 that Margaret thought of sometimes as the moment she understood something she had known for years, but had not quite seen clearly. She was standing at the kitchen window early in the morning, before the rest of the house was awake, watching the light come up over the east pasture in long gold lines, and Benjamin came in from the early check of the cattle, as he always did, and she heard him taking off his boots in the entryway, and then the familiar tread of his stockinged feet on the wooden floor, and he came into the kitchen, and she turned from the window, and he was there, just there, tall and familiar and achingly known. With the morning behind him, and the ranch around them, and the children sleeping in the next rooms, and he looked at her with those rain-gray eyes that she had been looking into for 8 years now. And they had not lost any of their particular effect. He said, "Good morning," in that low, warm voice that had said good morning to her 3,000 or so times by then, and she said, "Good morning," back, and handed him his coffee, and what she understood in that moment was that this ordinary Tuesday morning in 1882, with the summer light and the sleeping children and the coffee and the familiar voice, was the thing she had been moving toward on that January night in Richmond, when she had sat down with trembling hands to write a letter to a stranger. Not the dramatic moment of the wedding or the first declaration on the porch, though those were precious too, but this. The accumulated ordinary, the specific weight of a morning that was one of thousands of mornings with this man in this place, and each one worth more than all the impressive, uncertain mornings of before. She said, "I love this life we have." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup with that full, open expression, nothing held back. "So do I," he said. "Every day, so do I." Thomas came in at that moment, at 7 years old, with the morning energy of a child, who considers sleeping the most wasteful use of daylight yet devised, demanding breakfast and information about when they were going to ride out to check the south pasture fence. And Robert appeared behind him, quieter, holding onto the doorframe and blinking with the more measured morning pace of a child who was in no particular hurry to be awake, but had followed his brother on general principle. Benjamin lifted Robert up and settled him on his hip and reached out with his free arm and drew Thomas against his side and looked at Margaret over both their heads with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated happiness that she felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest like a warm hand and stay there. She said, "Sit down, all of you. Breakfast is nearly ready." And they did. Thomas talking at speed about the fence and the horses and some complicated grievance about a game he had been playing yesterday, and Robert eating with focused efficiency, and Benjamin listening to both of them with the same patient, complete attention he gave everything, and the morning light coming in golden through the kitchen window, and the coffee on the stove, and the smell of bread, and outside the ranch going on in all its particular, demanding, beautiful reality. This was the life Margaret Winslow had written a letter to find. This rangy, demanding, sun-bleached, wind-scoured, rich, good, real life, with this man who took her seriously and loved her honestly and built things with her that were meant to last. She had been brave enough, on one cold January night, to believe that something better was possible and to reach for it without knowing if she would find it. She had found it. And every morning she woke up in this house on this land with this family around her. She knew it. The autumn of 1882 brought a letter from Richmond, from her old friend Caroline, saying that Caroline was thinking of coming west, that she had heard so much about it in Margaret's letters over the years, and wondered if it was really as Margaret described, as large and open and demanding and worth it. Margaret wrote back a long letter that afternoon, sitting at the desk in the library room with the afternoon light slanting warm across the paper, and she described the land and the sky and the work and the community, all of it honestly, without making it easier or harder than it was. And at the end she wrote, "It is exactly what I described and more than I can describe. I came here 8 years ago believing I was making the best of a difficult situation, and I found instead that I was walking toward the best thing I would ever do. Whether this is the right choice for you, I cannot say. What I can tell you is that the size of the risk was proportional to the size of what came of it, and I have not spent a single day regretting the letter I wrote in January." She sealed the letter and gave it to Thomas to carry to town the next morning, which he did with the responsible gravity of a child who understands that letters are important, and then rode home at speed because he had promised his father he would be back before noon. Benjamin was in the yard when Thomas came back, working on a bridle that needed new stitching, and Thomas reported his errand delivered with the precision of someone who takes commissions seriously, and Benjamin said, "Good work." And Thomas beamed and immediately began asking about the south pasture again, and Benjamin set down the bridle and said, "All right, go saddle up," and Thomas was gone before the sentence was finished. Margaret watched from the porch. She had Robert beside her, leaning against her arm with the comfortable weight of a child who has chosen his person for the afternoon, watching his brother and father with the thoughtful attention he brought to watching everything. "Mama," Robert said, in the careful way that meant he was about to say something he had been considering. "Yes," she said. "Is the ranch going to be Thomas's when we're grown up?" he said. She looked down at him. He was looking out at the yard, not at her, his expression neutral in the way that meant he had feelings about the question that he had not decided to express yet. "The ranch will belong to both of you," she said. "This family built it together and it belongs together." He thought about this. "What if Thomas wants to run it and I want to do something else? Then that's something you and Thomas and your father and I will talk about when the time comes," she said. "There's no rule written anywhere that says you both have to want the same thing. There's only the rule that you work it out honestly." He nodded slowly in the deep considering way he had. "All right," he said, as though filing this for future reference. Out in the yard, Benjamin had boosted Thomas onto his horse and was explaining something, pointing south, and Thomas was listening with his whole body the way he listened to things that mattered to him, leaning forward slightly, eyes intent. She watched them, this man and his son, the same profile and the same quality of attention and the same particular way of turning toward the world, and she thought, this is what it means to build a life. This. The ranch and the letters and the learning and the children and the ordinary mornings. All of it together, every piece of it, adding up to something that could not have been predicted from any single part. She would not have traded it. Not for Richmond with its columns and its social certainties and its careful divisions of what women were permitted to want. Not for anything. The years went forward. The ranch endured. The family grew in the slow, persistent way of things that are well-rooted, putting down depth rather than simply height. Benjamin Langston and Margaret Winslow Langston built not just a cattle ranch in the red dust of Texas, but something that the land itself seemed to acknowledge, a piece of the frontier given order and care and continuity by two people who had chosen each other freely, and had found in that choice everything they had each been separately looking for. Ruth Calloway lived to see Thomas's wedding in 1896 to a young woman from Abilene named Sarah, who had her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's steadiness, and who took to the ranch as though she had always belonged there, because some people are simply made for certain landscapes and only need to find them. Henry Calloway had passed in 1891, quietly in his sleep, and Ruth had carried the grief of it with the same forthright practicality she brought to everything. And when she sat at Thomas's wedding table, she raised her glass and said, "Henry would have loved this day." And Margaret had reached over and taken her hand and held it, and Ruth had held back. Robert did, in fact, go his own way, taking a position with a land management company in Austin at the age of 20, which Benjamin received without protest or disappointment, because he had always understood that a person built to be useful needed to find the place where they were most useful, and Austin suited Robert in the way the ranch suited Thomas. He married a woman named Amelia in 1897 and came back to the ranch every summer with their growing family, and the house, which had been expanded again, was full of noise and children, and the particular chaos of a family that has roots deep enough to let its branches spread wide. Benjamin and Margaret sat on the porch in the summers with the next generation's children running in the yard and the old familiar sky above them, and they talked as they always had, about everything and nothing, about cattle prices and books and what Clara had said at Sunday dinner, and whether the well needed attention, and about larger things too, memories and losses and the deep satisfactions, and the things that had been hard and were worth being hard for what came of them. One evening in the summer of 1897, with the yard quiet and the children inside and the stars coming up over the plain in the particular way they did, infinite and certain, Benjamin said, "I've been thinking about that first drive from the stagecoach." "Have you?" Margaret said. "I was late," he said. "I've thought about that. I was late picking you up." She smiled at the dark. "You were 40 minutes late," she said. "Ruth Calloway gave me water and told me you were a good man." "She was right," he said, with the dry ease of a man entirely comfortable with his own goodness because he had spent 23 years earning it honestly. "She was," Margaret said. "The water was good too." He laughed, that low, warm laugh she had loved since the first time she had heard it, and reached over and took her hand in the way he always did, as naturally as breathing. She looked out at the land, the dark shapes of the pastures and the faint reflection of starlight on the windmill and the big comfortable shape of the barn, all of it theirs, all of it built and tended and meant, and she felt the weight of his hand in hers, and the weight of all those years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days and extraordinary ones, all accumulating into this particular Tuesday evening on the porch of a house on the Texas plain, with a man she had written a letter to and found everything in. "I'm glad I was afraid enough to be brave," she said. He turned to look at her. "What?" "That night I wrote the letter," she said. "I was afraid. I almost didn't write it. I thought it was foolish, and I thought nothing would come of it, and I thought I should stay in Richmond and find a sensible way to manage." She paused. "But I was more afraid of what I would become if I stayed, and that fear was bigger, and it moved my hand." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was doing what he always did, thinking it through honestly before speaking. "I didn't know I was lonely," he said at last. "I knew something was missing. I didn't know what it was until you were there, and it wasn't missing anymore." She turned to look at him, this man she knew so thoroughly, this face that was older now with 23 years of Texas sun and work and love in it, and she felt the same thing she had felt on the porch the first time they had held hands, that combination of enormous and simple that had no better word for it than what it was. "I love you," she said. She said it the way people say things they have said thousands of times and mean more each time. "I love you," he said. "Same." The stars went on above them in their great, indifferent abundance, and the horses moved in the barn, and somewhere in the house a child called for something and was answered by another voice, and the wind came in from the south with the smell of grass and dust and rain coming, and the land lay open around them under the wide Texas sky, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything, exactly, absolutely everything, and they both knew it and held it together, on the porch of the home they had built from a letter and two honest people willing to reach for something real. The rain came in an hour later, soft and steady, the kind of rain that soaks in rather than running off, good rain, the kind the land needed. They stayed on the porch for it, listening to it on the roof and the yard, letting it come. Thomas came out at one point at 22 and already carrying himself like the ranch was in his bones, and stood on the porch looking at the rain with satisfaction and said, "North pasture needed this." "It did," Benjamin agreed. Thomas looked at his parents, side by side in the porch chairs, and something moved across his face that might have been understanding, the particular understanding of a young man just beginning to see his parents as people rather than as the permanent fixtures of his universe. He said, "Good night, then," and went back inside, and they heard his boots on the stairs, and the house settled around them. Benjamin and Margaret sat with the rain coming down, and the night around them and the whole of their lives behind and before them, and it was good. It was so profoundly, specifically, irreversibly good, and they were both aware of it, which is not always given and should never be taken for granted. Margaret thought briefly of the woman she had been in Richmond, the careful, capable, half-living woman who had sat down with trembling hands on a January night and written a letter into the unknown. She wished she could tell her, "Be brave. It is worth it. Everything you cannot yet imagine is waiting out there in the red dust and the wind, and his name is Benjamin, and he will see you exactly as you are and love everything he sees, and the ranch will be real and the sky will be wider than you believe possible, and the life will be harder and better and truer than anything you have dared to picture. Be brave." She had been. And here, in the good rain on the Texas plain, with the man who had taught her what it meant to be truly met by another person, was everything that bravery had given her. Here was home.